Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So during today's lecture video, we are going to talk about development more socially with individuals in that middle childhood age range. So you will have an activity that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. Also, exam 2 is going to open today. So on February 17th at noon, 12 p.m., exam 2 opens. It'll be open for a week, so it'll close the following Monday at noon, 12 p.m. Make sure that you're noting when it opens, when it closes. It's opening and closing at noon, 12 p.m., not at midnight. So being aware of that. That exam is going to cover those 3 lecture videos that we've had since the last exam. So this is our shortest section of the class. If you have questions as you're studying, please let me know. I will also be posting a review video and a practice exam to help you guys prepare, but please let me know if you need anything, okay? Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about issues that are related to socio-emotional development in middle childhood. So we're going to be talking about several different topics that impact us during this part of our lives. We'll talk about some family situations, parenting, divorce. We'll talk about sibling relationships, peers. We'll also talk a little bit about peer pressure and prejudice. So some really important issues to discuss today. So first of all, talking about the family as a system, we know that families exist for a variety of reasons. It would be very difficult to list all the potential things that we gain from having a family. It talks about economic, so financial reasons, emotional support, so good for us to have intimate relationships with people, good for our psychological development, child rearing purposes, many other reasons why we group ourselves together into families so that we can not be alone, so that we have people to help us in our day-to-day life. But one thing to note as we're talking about relationships between family members is that parents are not all powerful. Sometimes we think of parents as being exclusively or at least primarily responsible for the way that their kids turn out. Certainly the parenting you received does play a role in your outcomes, but it's not the only important thing to consider. And also, the child impacts the parenting that they receive as well, so we know that some kids are easier to parent than others. More on that coming up. But what we also want to note is that when we're talking about families, families are impacted by those microsystems, so the relationships among family members, but they are also impacted by larger influences as well. You're going to see what I'm talking about here in this picture. So we have this microsystem here in the middle. This is kind of harkening back to Bronfenbrenner's theory. And what we see with the microsystem is that the parents, this is one potential way that a family could look. You have parents interacting with each other, and then parents interacting with the kids, and the kids interacting with each other. And so you have this dynamic process here. It's not just parents dictating the outcomes to their kids, but the kids are also impacting their parents and impacting each other, and this is all a dynamic, ongoing process. But then also the family is being impacted by larger influences as well, things like neighborhood, work, religious organizations, school, family, the media. It talks about culture at large, even the time period that you're living in. So all of these things impact the way that a family functions or does not function, and so it would be really easy for us to focus only on what's going on inside a home. And certainly what goes on inside a home is very important, but we need to be thinking about ways that our culture at large is encouraging or discouraging healthy families. And maybe there are some social norms we could change, some programs we could implement, some legislation we could use to try to improve what's happening inside of an individual home. So we've talked about parenting before. This should look familiar, these terms, but just as a review, we have these 2 dimensions of parenting. We have control, which we could also call structure or discipline, and then we have involvement, which we could also call warmth, affection, love, basically. So you'll see this term uninvolved here, and that's an adequate term, but you could also hear neglectful parenting, either one. We're referring to low control and low involvement. So a parent that's not really involved at all is a parent that doesn't seem to have structure or rules, and then is also not providing that love and affection as well. Authoritarian parenting happens when the parent does not provide that love and affection that's needed, but provides high levels of control, so a lot of structure, a lot of discipline here. And then with permissive parenting, we're seeing the opposite of authoritarian parenting. So it's going to be low on structure, low on control. The rules, if there are any, are not consistently reinforced, or rules that are not consistently forced for the children to follow. But we also do see that with the parental involvement that tends to be high with permissive parenting. So very loving, very affectionate, but unfortunately not providing that structure that we know that kids need. So authoritative is the ideal parenting. It's associated with the best outcomes. But one thing to note is that parenting research is correlational, because we can't randomly assign parents into a certain parenting type. Therefore, we can't do an experiment on parenting. So all we can do is correlational research, looking at two naturally occurring variables. This is the way you were parented, and these are your outcomes. And so this does tell us that there's a relationship between parenting styles and outcomes, but it doesn't explain what caused those outcomes. So just something to keep in mind as we're talking about parenting styles. So what about some specific behaviors that parents might engage in? Now, of course, this is not a comprehensive list of all the things that parents do, but a few things. Direct instruction, telling children what to do, when, and explaining why. I think direct instruction is something that we should use, especially with younger kids. One thing to keep in mind when you're giving direct instruction is that kids usually thrive with very specific instructions. So if you say, go clean your room, that may be too vague, especially for a younger child or a child with attention issues. You might do better with specific instructions like go put your dirty clothes in the dirty clothes basket, go put your toys in the toy box, a series of simple instructions. And also sometimes we spend our time telling kids what not to do, but we don't tell kids what to do. And we want to tell them what to do so that they can replace those behaviors with something positive. Instead of just saying, stop jumping on the couch, instead of saying, stop jumping on the couch, let's tell the kids to go do something positive that would prevent them from jumping on the couch, so they know what to do, not just what not to do. And then also it talks about coaching, so thinking about parents helping kids master. It talks about social and emotional skills here. So parents try to teach their kids social norms, right? Don't stare at other people, share your toys, be nice. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all, because parents want their kids to have good outcomes and have good relationships. But something that might be a little less direct would be modeling, and this is kind of scary if you have kids. Thinking about children following you around, watching what you're doing and imitating you. Sometimes we're aware that kids are imitating us and paying attention to us, and sometimes they sneak up on us and we don't realize this is happening. But kids will model what they see their parents do. And then also when it talks about feedback through reinforcement, this is referring to the consequences of behaviors. So if a child does a behavior that we want to encourage, we reinforce or reward that behavior, and it's more likely to happen again. If a child does a behavior we want to discourage, then we punish that behavior, and then hopefully it will happen less. Remembering that our reinforcement and punishment needs to be appropriate and immediate and consistent to have the best results. Now, when we're thinking about things that impact kids, we have to talk about marital conflict. The discussion of divorce is coming up in a second, and we know that that's an important topic in this day and age in our culture. So first of all, just generally speaking about chronic parental conflict. Conflict is unavoidable, especially when you think about in a marriage relationship where decisions have to be made and they impact each other. A definition of conflict might just be that we have a difference in our goals or our motivations or our opinions on a particular subject. So the fact that we differ from someone else is inevitable. The problem is not the conflict. The problem is not knowing how to handle the conflict. And when we have chronic conflict that is not handled the right way, that makes it difficult for a child to feel safe, can induce some anxiety in a child. And also when parents are putting a lot of time and energy into resolving conflict, it makes it harder, not impossible, but harder for them to do this high quality authoritative parenting. But we know that stress doesn't just come from relationship problems. Stress could also come from unemployment or work situations. There's often a question about whether it is harmful to have both parents working outside of the home. And the question is often answered in a sense that it matters not so much if you're both working outside of the home, but what kind of job are you doing? If you're doing jobs that are high in stress, then that can make it even more difficult to parent appropriately because of how much pressure a person feels on a day-to-day basis. So it is important for parents to work together as a team, knowing that each parent has something unique that they can contribute to the child. And even if you're having conflict, finding a way to co-parent, to work together is really crucial for good outcomes in kids. So it talks about parents and children affecting each other and whether or not the family functions. This is what I was saying about it's not just the parents impacting the kids, but the kids also impact the parents. So parenting styles differ with the child's age, cognitive development, temperament. For example, here it talks about temperamentally active children. We know that kids that are very active can be difficult to parent, thinking about maybe a child with ADHD. A child that is temperamentally active may require greater parental control because the child may not have as much self-control. They may need that modeled for them. They may need a very structured environment. And the research says that kids that have attention problems are more likely to be involved in accidents, probably just because they're not paying attention to their environments. So you can see why you might need more hands-on parenting or a different parenting style for a very active child. But you also think about the child's age. So authoritative parenting is best when we're considering younger children. But think about with older adolescents, maybe getting into the college age, it's probably healthier for a parent to transition slowly into a more permissive parenting style. I say that because a parent should not be in control and providing as much structure for their college age child versus a child that lives at home with them perhaps. So kind of gradually relinquishing that control in an age-appropriate way, giving kids some independence is important. But then also thinking about the gender of the child, maybe something that impacts parenting. There is some research to suggest that especially fathers often parent sons and daughters differently. So there are lots of things that impact the parenting that a child receives. What about sibling relationships? So sometimes people struggle with decisions about how many kids they're going to have and how far apart they want to have those kids because they're concerned about the relationship between siblings. So we do know that it can be almost a traumatic experience depending on how it's handled for a child to have a sibling. I think that this does not have to be the case though. It talks about responsive, involving parenting can be very helpful for children to kind of adapt to that change in the family life. What we can see is that when you bring home a baby, an older child, especially if that child is, 2, 3, still fairly young, is probably going to have some regression here, basically just meaning that the baby's getting a lot of attention. So maybe if I use a pacifier, if I wear a diaper, if I get in the baby's crib, then I'll get that kind of attention. So that's usually not a long-term problem, and having parents be responsive and loving to both or all of the children can be really helpful here. But of course we want siblings to get along with each other, and research suggests that siblings get along most in a few particular situations. So first of all, in adolescence, I think some level of conflict is inevitable in young kids who have not had that biological brain development to be able to handle impulse control and empathy and that kind of thing. They also do better if they're same sex, so brothers getting along with brothers and sisters getting along with sisters. Not that parents have a lot of direct control over that, as well as neither being too emotional. You can see how that could be the case. But what you can help here is parents having a good relationship and not playing favorites. I can't say this enough, that when a parent plays favorites and compares, I wish you were more like your sibling, that's a toxic environment, and that's not something that's healthy. And I don't think most parents do this on purpose, but it's something really dangerous that we should definitely be keeping an eye on, because there are a lot of harm that can be done that way. All right. As I said, there are lots of ways to form a family, and adopting children could potentially be one way to form a family. It says that about 2 to 4% of U.S. children are adopted. You might also be thinking about foster children. Could be another way that a family could be set up. So on average, adopted children tend to do quite well, but you might find problems more based on the situation. So for one thing, you have to think about the age at which the child was adopted. If a child is adopted at a later age, they might have had some problems with their care they received leading up to the adoption, maybe going through a series of foster homes, maybe having some kind of abusive or neglectful situation in their family of origin, that kind of thing. And so that could potentially then bleed over into problems later in life. But usually with loving, consistent parenting by the adoptive family, a lot of these problems can be reduced, and you might think about talking to a counselor or having some kind of social support there for the family at large, not just the child, but for the family as they're adjusting to this new norm. And then, of course, there are things you have to consider with adopted children that you might not have to consider in other situations. Things like whether or not you're going to tell the child they're adopted, which is a complex issue. I don't have the right answer for that, but it's certainly something that you would have to put a lot of thought into. So, if we're talking about families and things that impact families, I want to camp out here on divorce for a bit. And before I get into the slides here, one thing I just want to say is that our divorce rate right now is about 50% in our culture, or some of the recent numbers are even slightly over 50%. And I think that this is unfortunate. I think the fact that divorce has become normalized in our culture, that we think that divorce is okay because we've seen so many people get divorced and it is so common. But what we should be thinking about here is the impact of divorce. And divorce does have some negative impacts on children. And so I think that instead of normalizing divorce, I think we should be putting more effort into supporting marriages and families and trying to save some of these marriages if at all possible. Some effects that we see on children, a lot of this depends on the conflict leading up to the divorce, as well as whether or not the parents are able to still consistently co-parent later on. Of course, you're going to do better if the parents can cooperate, if they can still be authoritative and work together with each other about setting rules and consistently enforcing those rules. That can be really helpful. But we do see that children are more likely to have problems with things like school. When it talks about conduct, we're talking about behavior, adjustments, usually referring to psychological issues, the way that they see themselves, the way they see relationships, as well as their relationships with their parents. It's possible that a child might blame one parent or feel overly attached to one parent and kind of detached from another parent. And we do see that children whose parents have divorced are more likely to divorce themselves. Now, this is on average, generally speaking. Of course, there are some people who went through a divorce as a child and said, okay, when I get married, I'm never going to get divorced because I don't want my kids to go through that. So certainly this is not something that has to happen, but the research says on average you are more likely to divorce if your parents divorced, and maybe that's because you're modeling the conflict resolution styles. Maybe that's because you don't value marriage as much because your parents didn't value marriage as much, that kind of thing. But there tends to be overall a reduction in life satisfaction and an increase in depression. So divorce is a serious issue, and it's one that we should treat as a serious issue. And when we're talking about how divorce impacts kids, we know that there are some negative impacts. How does divorce actually impact kids? Well, probably the biggest issue here is that there's parental conflict, and they're watching their parents have this conflict. Usually leading up to the divorce, there's conflict, and the parents are fighting in front of the kids. Now, I think you should resolve conflict in front of your kids if you can do it in a calm manner. I think it's important to model for kids that conflict happens, and this is how we can cooperate and how we can compromise. I think that's great. But unfortunately, sometimes conflict is not handled in healthy ways, and we do that in front of kids. We think the kids aren't paying attention, but they are. So they see this parental conflict. Also, economic hardship. So maybe if parents split up, we're living with mom, and maybe mom is in poverty now because women don't make as much money, or because maybe mom was out of the workforce, that kind of thing. And then also just not having somebody there to provide supervision and a role model to help you with your homework, to answer your questions, to provide emotional support. So How does divorce impact a child? It depends on the child. Emotionally insecure children who are not securely attached, are especially at risk for having problems associated with their parents' divorce. So then what can we do? Well, we can try to reduce the conflict, handle the conflict in a mature way. There's always the question of whether parents should stay together for the kids. And there are two sides to that. First of all, I can't tell you from a parent standpoint, would I be happier with my spouse? That's a different question. But from the standpoint of, would my child be better off? Kids are better in two-parent households if they can manage to keep that household free of that toxic conflict. But if you can't keep the household free of that toxic conflict, then it might be better to separate if that then protects the child from having to see that kind of conflict, right? So definitely something to think about here. Divorce does have a major impact on kids. It is most harmful when it happens during childhood or adolescence. During preschool years, the child may not remember a lot of the conflict and things leading up to the divorce, might not really understand it, so that by the time they are understanding things, maybe they're already in a single-parent household and that seems normal to them. And then in the later years, your view of yourself and your view of relationships is more set, and maybe you have more coping skills and things like that. So it's not as harmful during those later years, but especially during childhood and adolescence, when kids are making decisions about how they feel about themselves and about relationships, that's when it tends to be most harmful. And also it talks about children who are emotional or who view things very negatively. When we think about viewing things negatively, we often think about depression. So kids that tend to be a little bit more negative in their thinking are more likely to be harmed, especially long term, from a divorce situation. So it is helpful to try to reduce some of the negative thoughts that kids have. Kids often blame themselves, so making sure kids know it's not their fault, making sure that you don't make them compete for the child. So everyone should pour into the child. The child should not feel like they have to choose between parents, that kind of thing. And not saying anything negative about the other parent, which may be tempting to do when you've just been hurt, when you've been through a painful divorce. But find somebody else to talk to about this. Don't talk to the child about it. And try to teach kids healthy coping mechanisms. How do you handle stress? How do you handle it when you're sad? Versus sometimes we model ways of dealing with problems that are just not very helpful for kids. All right. Lots of important information today. If divorce is very common today, then we know that blended families are also fairly common. So when parents divorce, sometimes they remarry, and then you have step parents or step siblings that are part of the family as well. One thing to note is that there are higher divorce rates in subsequent marriages versus a first marriage. So second marriages, third marriages, etc. Perhaps we never dealt with the reason why we initially got divorced, and so that conflict style is still there, that kind of thing. But it may also be that people who don't have as much respect for marriage are the ones who get divorced, and so they carry that attitude with them. Or it could be that being in a blended family is stressful, and that could be part of the reason as well. So when we're talking about blended families, we're reorganizing our family with new members. We can see problems with kids, especially during adolescence. We may be having problems with school, having symptoms like sadness and not enjoying things anymore that we associate with depression. But if we can have some loving, caring, consistent parenting by all the people involved, mom, dad, stepmom, stepdad, etc., then that can be really helpful. It talks about them being especially negative outcomes when stepfathers bring their own children, and for some reason this particular situation seems to be hard, and maybe it's because we traditionally think of the father as being the authority figure, and now we're trying to figure out who has the authority now. The best thing to do is to have authority be shared and have consistent rules and loving affection from all the parents in a child's life. All right. Now, we're talking about factors that impact kids. This is something that we have to talk about, but it's a very difficult topic, talking about child maltreatment, things like neglect and abuse. It says 3 to 4 million children in our country are neglected or abused in some way, and you have to know that this is likely not an accurate number because there are certainly cases that are not reported. So it could be even higher. Typically we're seeing that neglect is the most common type of child maltreatment. And we're talking about neglect, we are withholding something that the child needs. It talks about food, clothing, medical care, but you might also think of neglect as being withholding love and affection, that kind of thing. And then in addition to neglect, you may also see physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, or you may see situations where there's some combination of these. So obviously this is horrific, and we want to try to prevent this as much as possible. And so we have to do research on child maltreatment to try to understand why it happens and how to reduce it. And so when we have an understanding of when this happens and what are the risk factors, then we can try to make some positive changes here. So who are the abusing parents? What I want to say here is that I am aware of who I'm talking to. I know that I am teaching at a university in Mississippi, and that spanking is very common in our country, and especially in the South. And so a lot of us have had experience with spanking. Spanking is considered the norm. As a matter of fact, there's sometimes a negative viewpoint of parents who don't spank their kids. It's not my job to tell you about my personal opinions or preferences on this topic. It's my job to tell you what the research says. So there are several things to think about when it comes to spanking. First of all, the research says that spanking is associated with negative outcomes in kids. Now, this is correlational because I cannot randomly assign parents into certain parenting styles or into certain discipline techniques. So because it's correlational, we can't determine causation here. Having said that, there's a strong association between physical punishment. You might also hear corporal punishment. We're talking about spanking primarily, but anything that causes pain is associated with negative psychological outcomes in kids. In addition to that, it is also not associated with compliance. So the research says that kids that are spanked may temporarily behave in front of the person who does the spanking, but they are less likely to behave when the person who does the spanking is not there, and then they are less likely to behave later on in life when they are too old to spank, when spanking is something they have outgrown. So there's certainly some concern here about whether or not spanking works and whether or not it is safe to do this for kids, because we have these negative outcomes. But another thing that's related to safety is that maltreatment risk, abuse and neglect, is highest in cultures that condone physical punishment like our culture, and the numbers in the United States reflect this. So the thought here is, if we think of spanking as being okay, and we tell parents it's okay to spank your kids, then there's a very fine line between what is spanking and what is abuse. And where you put that line might depend on the parenting that you've received or your view of the situation. But it would be very easy in a moment of frustration to cross that line or to not know where that line is. And so for those reasons, there's certainly a lot of research to suggest that spanking is not the best choice for discipline. And there are other choices, things like negative punishment. So positive punishment means you're adding something like pain. Physical punishment would be positive punishment. Negative punishment means taking something away. And negative punishment is more natural in our culture. When you get a speeding ticket, they don't spank you, they take away your money. When you don't do your job at your job, they don't spank you, they fire you, they take away your money or your opportunities to earn money there. So negative punishment is more natural in our culture. Things like timeout, response cost, where kids basically lose freedom, things like grounding, that kind of thing, can be as effective or more natural based on what we do in society. Now, having said that, if you have any questions about any of this, you can feel free to email me on that. Alright, so effective abuse on kids. We know that abuse is a serious issue that can have long-term psychological damage, even if there's not physical damage. We see associations between childhood mistreatment and things like poor peer relationships, so they might be modeling the abuse that they received and being abusive towards their friends, and then later we see they're more likely to abuse their own children, so having an increase in aggression here. School problems, it's very hard to focus at school when someone's being abused at home. This can impact your development, it can cause depression, as well as other psychological problems. There is an increased risk for even self-harm later on in life. So because we know that abuse is a serious issue, then we should take every opportunity to try to reduce the risk factors that are associated with abuse. So how can we prevent, or at least attempt to prevent, childhood maltreatment? Well, first of all, we've already said that cultures that condone physical punishment tend to have high rates of child maltreatment, so we need to try to educate and reduce the times, the chances that parents have for using physical punishment. Also, anything that increases stress in a parent's life makes them at risk for being abusive, or at the very least for not having the best parenting style. So things like trying to reduce poverty, social stresses, maybe thinking about things like the parents' mental health, providing training for parents. Parent management training is something that is available, but oftentimes it's expensive and may be hard to find places that are doing it. There may be wait lists, so we need to increase this education and training. Providing opportunities to vent, because parents may just be stressed out and not have any other vent for their frustration, and so they end up venting it towards their kids. So providing outlets for parents for stress and frustration can be really helpful. I think if we support the mental health of parents, that could be a really great way to support the mental health of kids. Alright, so kind of shifting gears from family relationships to friendships. During middle childhood, we know that friendship relationships are especially important. How would you define friendship? Well, friendship could be called a voluntary relationship, so it's not really a friendship if it's forced. A voluntary relationship based on mutual liking. But what mutual liking looks like depends a little bit on your age. So we see that younger kids usually form friendships based on common interests. So I like Star Wars, you like Star Wars, let's be friends, that kind of thing. And then as you move into that middle childhood time period, then common interests are still important, but also psychological characteristics. You're a friendly person, a helpful person, a trustworthy person. And all these things continue to be important, but adolescents might also think about, can I trust you, and can I be myself with you? Can I have a close relationship? Thinking about trust, we know that middle childhood and adolescence are times when sometimes we're hurt by other people. Sometimes you think about gossip and slander and passing on private information. So certainly it is important to understand who you can trust and who you can't trust. It talks about intimacy, that psychological connection, being especially important for girls. Boys are more likely to say that they have a group of friends. Girls are more likely to say that they have a one-on-one best friend, or at least they're more likely to say they want to have a one-on-one best friend. And so that's especially important for girls during this time period and adolescence. So good friendships are important throughout the lifespan, but middle childhood may be the first time that kids are really forming substantial friendships. Friendships are important because they're correlated with higher self-esteem, decreased risk of depression, more appropriate behaviors, being able to cope with stress. But once again, this is a correlation. It's also possible that good friendships happen because the people who are in those friendships already have high self-esteem, less depression, better behavior. So it's a correlation, but friendships are important. It's important to have someone you can talk to. It talks about co-rumination here. If you have a peer that's going through some of the same things that you're going through right now, then you feel like you have that common bond, and that can be really helpful for kids as they're trying to navigate this, new social world for them. Having said that, though, there is always the risk that kids might reinforce behaviors that should not be reinforced. And I think this is where parents often get concerned. Is my child going to learn bad behavior from their friends? And so parents try different techniques to try to control who their child befriends. Some may be more effective than others. And I do wonder at what age our parents stop trying to influence who our friends are and kind of gradually relinquish that control. So when we're talking about friendships, you don't necessarily just have one-on-one relationships, which would really be the way you would define a friendship, but you might have a group of friends. So a clique would be defined as a small group versus a crowd that is a larger group. And a clique tends to be made up of people who are very similar to each other. You might be thinking about Mean Girls here, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be the popular kids clique. But a clique is a group of kids that have things in common. A crowd would be a larger group that has some differences, maybe different genders. We have maybe slightly different ages, although some of their attitudes and values are still probably pretty similar. Now, who will a child seek out when it comes to friends? Well, it depends on your parenting. If a child has received consistent, loving, authoritative parenting, then they are more likely to have friends who also have that same kind of parenting, and then therefore are more likely to behave, less likely to get into trouble. On the other hand, a child that has received neglectful parenting or permissive parenting may seek out peers that have also been involved with neglectful and permissive parenting, and therefore may be less likely to engage in those healthy behaviors. Might be kind of looking for rebellion. One thing that we see with permissive parenting, and I would imagine with neglectful parenting as well, is things like substance use can be a little bit higher here, academic problems, those kinds of things. So oftentimes kids look for friends that have similar parenting situations to their own. So one thing that parents can do here is just to provide that authoritative, loving, consistent parenting. It can be really helpful for a host of reasons. All right. Really good. A lot of important topics today. When we're talking about peer pressure, this is important to think about when it comes to groups that you spend time around. So we have this pressure to conform, and conformity could be changing the way we think, the way we talk, the way we behave to match up the behavior of other people, what we think that the other people want us to do. Peer pressure is something that doesn't go away. It's not like it's only something happening during middle childhood and adolescence. It kind of goes on throughout life, but it is most powerful when the kids are younger. And when the kids are socially anxious, like I really want to be liked, and therefore I feel like I have to do whatever the peers want me to do. Also, if they think that the peers are people that they look up to, that they want to be like, these are the popular kids or the successful kids, then they're more likely to go along with what they want them to do. And then when behavioral standards are ambiguous, so if there's not a firm rule here that's being broken, then there may be this fine line where we're not sure if this is okay or not, and if we're not sure if it's okay, we may just go along with what our peers are doing. Now, we usually think of peer pressure as being a negative thing, and it often is, but it could be positive. What if all of your friends are getting together to study? And maybe you don't want to study, but you want to be with your friends, so you go to the study party anyway. Or maybe all of your friends have started exercising, and you decide to exercise just so you can be with your friends. So if your friends are doing something positive and you feel pressured to join in, that could be a good thing. But oftentimes we think of peer pressure as being a negative thing. So this goes into your activity. Activity 6 asks you, how much of a problem is peer pressure? And what can parents do to help their children prepare for peer pressure? So I want you to think about the outcomes here. Do you think kids are having long-term negative outcomes because of peer pressure? Do you think peer pressure is usually positive or negative? What kinds of things are kids these days peer pressured into? And then if we know that kids are going to face peer pressure, how can parents prepare them so that they can say no, so they can stand up to their peers when their peers want them to do something that is dangerous? So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. You guys are a little bit closer to this age range where peer pressure is especially prevalent. So I look forward to reading your responses and hearing your thoughts on this. All right. Now, if we're talking about friendships, we have to think about the way that the friends or the group at large views a child. So there are several different categories based on popularity and rejection here. And these first few categories are kind of intense categories versus the other two that are kind of less intense. So a child that is popular, this means that they usually have a lot of people that really like them. It's a very intense, everybody likes, or most people like this child. Now, this could be positive or negative for the child. Now, let's think about that. We normally think of being the popular kid as being great, but there are negatives to it. If you're the popular kid, maybe you feel that pressure to continue to be popular. Maybe you feel like then you have to go along with peer pressure because you want to keep that popularity. You're afraid of losing it. So potentially it could be a bad thing. On the flip side of this, we could also have this intense category of being a rejected child where most of your classmates dislike you, in which case this can be a really negative experience for the child. This can be very harmful psychologically. And it could be that the child is aggressive. So maybe the kids reject the child because they're a bully, because they're mean, that kind of thing. But it could also be because the child seems just different from them, withdrawn for some reason, can also lead to the child being rejected. And then we can have this kind of split with a controversial child where some of their classmates like them and some of them dislike them, but this is still an intense category. So this would be the people who like you really like you, and the people who dislike you really dislike you. So kind of torn down the middle. An average child is similar to controversial in that some people like you and some people dislike you, but it's not as intense. So the people who like you okay. And the people who dislike you are just like, I'm not sure I like that person. But it's not very intense, just kind of average. And then finally, we may have some kids that are just neglected. It's not that we dislike the child, it's just that we don't consider them, we don't include them, we don't spend a lot of time with them. Now, you can see that the category that you put yourself in could impact the way that you see yourself, could impact the future relationships that you have. So there can be some lingering impacts of being rejected. So then let's think about what makes a child more likely to be rejected by their peers. I know we're talking a lot about parenting today, but there's a lot of research to say parenting is important. If you are a rejected child, you are more likely to have parents that have this belligerent, combative, intimidating, aggressive style. Maybe the problem is that the child watches their parents try to control and manipulate other people, and therefore the child then tries to control and manipulate other people, and this leads to the child being rejected. We can also see with inconsistent discipline, so the child's not really sure what's okay and what's not okay with behavior. This can also lead to a child being rejected by peers, parents that are not loving or consistent or warm. And when it talks about children imitating these behaviors, you want to have loving, consistent, positive, pro-social behaviors towards your kids because you want your kids to be loving, consistent, positive, pro-social people. So modeling that for your kids and showing them that they're a person of value. Now, there's a theory that parents place these conditions of worth on their kids where I'm only going to love you if you do this, or if you have this kind of grade, or if you have this kind of athletic performance or whatever. That is so harmful to kids. Kids need to be loved unconditionally. And so certainly there are things that parents can do to try to reduce the harm that kids face. Of course, we can't wrap our kids up in bubble wrap and protect them from everything. Believe me, I've tried. All right, a little bit more to say about aggression, because kids who are aggressive can then become rejected because people don't want to be friends with the bully, that kind of thing. So let's think about aggressive children and then children who are on the receiving end of aggression. First of all, there are different types of aggression. Instrumental aggression is being aggressive towards someone in order to get something. Like, I'm going to bully you so that I can copy your homework. You're getting something out of that person. Hostile aggression is just that kind of angry, out of control, impulsive, attacking someone just because I'm angry. And then relational aggression is something that we see more in girls than we do in boys, but it tends to be things like gossip and slander and trying to start rumors and trying to break up friendships and that kind of thing. Now, we do see a relationship between aggressive behaviors in kids and aggressive behaviors in adults. Some kids are aggressive and then they grow out of it, but a lot of times this predicts future behavioral problems as adults. So if we could catch kids who are aggressive early and try to solve problems there, then we could reduce harm later in life. So then what about the people who have been bullied? So bullying is a serious issue that has a wide range of effects on kids. It talks about victims of bullying having low self-esteem, not liking school. So you can see that this can be associated with psychological problems, but then also if the child tries to avoid school, doesn't enjoy school, it harms academic performance. This can then hurt opportunities later in life. So there can be long-term impacts here. So children who are bullied, maybe the bullies get bullied, potentially, or children that the bullies think won't stand up for themselves, and so kids who are withdrawn or submissive might be a little bit more likely to be picked on as well. So parents then have the difficult responsibility to teach their kids to stand up for themselves, but to stand up for themselves in a way that is appropriate, being assertive but not being aggressive themselves, not wanting to turn your child into a bully, just teaching them how to handle bully situations, which is a very difficult thing, but an important thing to do. Now, something that we often think about when we think about aggression, is aggression nature or is it nurture? Do we learn aggression because we watch violent television? Well, a couple things to think about with television. First of all, most people watch a lot of television. So it talks here about a high school graduate has watched 2 years worth of TV by the time they reach that point, which is quite a bit. So a couple things to think about. What kinds of television shows are they watching, and what are they not doing because they're watching TV? So first of all, we do see some positive outcomes associated with watching high quality programming. So educational television tends to be better. So that in and of itself is something to think about, making sure kids are watching high quality television. Kids may be modeling aggression, impulsivity, bad decision making, language, whatever, gender stereotypes that they see on television. So being very careful about what kids are exposed to, because something that I've been hearing about a lot recently would be kids who are saying, making threats or talking about self-harm or encouraging other kids to engage in self-harm, and they don't even know what they're talking about, but they heard it on YouTube or they heard it on some kind of video game that they're playing. So being aware that there are negative things out there that kids don't need to be exposed to, making sure that kids are watching high-quality programming. But then also the question is, what are you doing and what are you not doing because you're watching television? So the problem is not the television. The problem is kids need to read books. Kids need to interact with other people. Kids need to exercise. And so sometimes we think that television is the problem. Television is okay as long as we're still doing those good things outside of our television watching time. Research does not really support TV watching impacting attention span, concentration, or being a lazy, uncreative person. In and of itself, television's not a bad thing, but be cautious that television is not replacing all of those other good things that should still be going on as well. So just like with television, we have to be concerned about what kinds of video games that kids are playing. We do see a correlation between aggression in kids and watching aggressive movies and playing aggressive games, especially with video games, because with video games you're controlling the character, so you're causing the violent action to happen. Having said that, this is primarily correlational research. It is possible that kids who are already more aggressive then are more likely to choose aggressive shows or to choose aggressive video games. So instead of the video game making them aggressive, the aggression is the reason why they chose that video game. So there are some benefits to video games. They can help with processing speed, spatial skills. There are some games that are educational. However, there's always that risk of becoming addicted, which I think there's also a risk of becoming addicted to TV. Thinking of being addicted to TV or computer sounds kind of strange, but we think about someone who is experiencing tolerance and withdrawals and spending too much time watching television. I mean, you could see that you could easily become addicted to Netflix, right? All right, just a couple other things to think about here. During middle childhood, we are beginning to really form our self-concept. And so we're going to start describing ourselves and describing others. And as you get older, this is going to be a richer description with more detail. You understand characteristics better. So young kids describe themselves and others in mostly concrete terms. So my daughter says, I have red hair and blue eyes and I like to dance and that kind of thing. Concrete terms. As you get older, you include other traits as well, but usually kids up until around age 10 still focus on positive traits. So I like this game, I like to do this, so-and-so is good at that, without really acknowledging weaknesses. But then older kids are more likely to say, well, I'm good at some things, I'm not so good at other things, which I think it's important for kids to know strengths and weaknesses. If you don't know your weaknesses, then you don't know what you need to be working on to improve. So as you get older, you have a more complete, complex picture of yourself and of other people. Now, it talks about young children can sometimes think about psychological traits earlier than this, but oftentimes it's probably because they're just repeating back what they've heard other people say, repeating back what they've heard their parents say. So my parent says it's selfish when I won't share. So then I say that person's selfish because they won't share. They might just be parroting back what they heard you say. They might not really understand what it is that they're talking about. So when we talk about describing yourself and describing other people, it is important for us, as we kind of wrap up lecture today, to think about prejudice and the origins of prejudice and how we can try to reduce it. So prejudice is an attitude that we have towards other people because of their group membership. And an attitude is made up of our feelings and our thoughts and our behaviors. Now, we usually think of prejudice as being negative. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It is often negative. But you could have a positive prejudice where just because you're in this group, I like you. So think about, we like celebrities, we like athletes. Just because they're in that group, you're a celebrity, you're an athlete, so I like you. Having said that, though, primarily when we're thinking about prejudice, we're thinking about not liking someone because of group membership. So prejudice is obviously a serious issue. We could have prejudice based on race, based on gender, based on age, based on physical appearance, based on any number of characteristics, really anything that puts a person in a distinguishable group, your religious beliefs, your hobbies, whatever. So younger children primarily experience prejudice as I really like myself, and I like my friends who I chose because we have things in common. Think back to a few slides before. We tend to be more comfortable around people who are like us, and we tend to like ourselves. Therefore, we like our friends who are like us. So in the beginning, prejudice is not usually I dislike people who are different. I just really like myself. I have high self-esteem, and so I think I'm a good person. And then therefore, it's fairly natural to think that people who are like me are also good people. And so young children don't necessarily have a hostile approach towards other people. Although if they've been taught to have a hostile approach, this could potentially develop a little bit earlier. But they just think that I like the people who are like me and I like the people who like me. The problem is that this could very easily develop into having negative thoughts, negative feelings, negative behaviors towards people just because they are different from us. So if we could try to reduce this, catch this in kids, I think it would be easier to try to reduce the impact from prejudice. The problem is that it's very hard to reduce prejudice because we live in a culture that is still plagued with prejudice, and so it's a very difficult thing to try to do. Oftentimes the answer is, well, we just need to expose people to people who are different from them. And I agree with that, but the research says that there's certain ways in which to do this. So bringing in different groups of people works if these two things in particular are met. First of all, they have to be of equal status, and they have to be working towards a common goal. If one group is somehow superior or given extra responsibilities or given authority over another group, that does not reduce prejudice. That creates prejudice. So they need to be on equal footing, and they need to be working towards a common goal so that you are now part of my group. We're on the same team. Instead of this is my in group and you're my out group, now you're part of my in group because we're working towards a common goal. So if you can create a situation where there's equal footing and we're all working together, that's when prejudice is most likely to be reduced. Also, things that are helpful, educating parents about the dangers of prejudice, trying not to expose your children to prejudice thinking, addressing it when they do hear it, because they will hear it, addressing it, making sure that we understand that human beings deserve dignity and respect regardless of any number of characteristics they might or may not possess. Educating the kids, educating parents, and then it talks about fairness. Kids are usually very big on fairness. If there's anything that frustrates me, it's the fact that my kids, if one of them gets something, immediately the other one wants it. You know, my big kids, it's like, he got a juice box, so I want a juice box. Even if she's not thirsty. She just wants a juice box because he got a juice box, because that seems to be fair. So kids understand fairness. So if you think, okay, well, I'm going to give the boys this kind of treatment and the girls a different kind of treatment, is that fair? Or I'm going to give this group of kids a different treatment and this group of kids a different treatment. They'll say, well, no, that's not fair. And so that can help them to understand why prejudice is a problem and how it leads to discrimination. Discrimination specifically refers to the behaviors that are associated with prejudice, treating people differently because of group membership. All right, lots of important topics for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Now you have all the information that you need for exam 2. So I will also be posting a brief review video where I talk about the study guide. But let me know if you have questions while you study. Don't forget about your activity for this week. And then I will talk to you guys again after exam 2. So you guys have a great day.